Alrighty, welcome back, friends, to hopefully our last video for today, or for this week, whatever time you're considering doing this. So we've introduced this idea of waste, right, and what it is, kind of how much of it is generated, and then what do we do with it, right? So that was the previous two videos, and for this subset, we are going to look at shrinking the waste system. And I want to preface this video with acknowledging the fact that I know that companies, large companies, are the ones who are producing the most amount of waste and not dealing with it properly. And, it shouldn't be all on the consumer, you and me. However, these are things that we can do, our very own little footprint to shrink that down. But I just wanted to start out with that little preface. I do recognize that it shouldn't be all on us, but these are ways that you can reduce your footprint without feeling super guilty, if that makes sense. All right. Starting with the 5 R's, and perhaps you've heard of some of these, right? So reduce, reuse, recycle. I think those are the main 3 that we are kind of bombarded with a lot of the time when we're kids, or as we're growing up, I guess. But there are a couple in here that aren't in the 3 that we've been kind of bombarded with. So refuse, I think, is really the number one thing that you can do. And then rot. I know it sounds kind of gross, but it's true, right? So I'm going to go through each of these ideas in a bit further detail. And so shrinking the waste system, by the way, there is a reason why it's in this order. There is a typo here, so just think that N is not there. When I post the slides, it won't be there. But in this order is going to be the most effective way for you to deal with shrinking your waste. Starting with refuse, right? So this is your first and best option, right? So oddly enough, this is even better than reducing and reusing because you're lessening the amount that you would have to reduce or reuse. It's also much better than recycling. We'll talk about the things about recycling later on. And I want you to consider which waste that you can completely or simply avoid altogether, right? Thinking about this, do we need it or do we just want it, or are we simply just lazy, and considering, changing our habits and cultural norms, right? So do you have to order caviar takeout every single day, 3 times a day, and produce that much plastic waste or compostable waste, right? Not necessarily, right? You can learn how to cook, even if you're someone who barely knows how to cook at all. You can, learn how to cook a simple box of mac and cheese, or make a sandwich or something, right? Like you can reduce the amount that you, you can refuse the amount that you perhaps go through in a day-to-day basis. And with something, this graphic here, I think is pretty fascinating. It's pretty amazing that our society has reached a point where the effort necessary to extract the oil from the ground, ship it to a refinery, turn it into plastic, shape it appropriately, truck it to a store, buy it, and bring it home is considered to be less effort than what it takes to just wash a spoon when you're using it. Right? So this idea of like plastic utensils versus silverware, or like having silverware, right? So you're using way more if you are just constantly using plastic versus having a set of dishes or dishware, right? Again, eating at home or trying to eat at home more versus eating out. But overall, we are just a huge consumer society. I think a lot of us have recognize this idea, right? It's always buy. I have to have this. I have to have that. I have to follow this influencer. I have to go and buy what this person is showcasing. I have to do this. I have to get a brand new iPhone every single time a new one comes out. I have to go and buy a new hoodie from my favorite restaurant every time they come out with a new one. It's like this over-consuming culture, and we really need to learn to kind of like to put a pause on that and to break that, or to try to break that habit. It's not easy, right? But it is certainly doable. Next, we have reducing, right? So personal habits, right? Again, going back to this, do we need it? Do we want it? Or are we simply just not thinking, right? Are we just trying to take in as much as we can? But really a good place to start here is by decreasing packaging, right? So packaging can make up to about 50% of the MSW by volume. And then, of course, reducing at an industry level. So not just as an individual, but as an industry, of course, I believe can make the most impact, and they can benefit by producing less waste, right? So using using less raw materials means spending less money, right? Which means more profits. Producing less waste, of course, means less fees for solid and hazardous waste disposal. Fun facts, trash is not free, which actually that's part of your assignment this week. What are your assignments this week? And then, of course, less non-essential packaging can save money. So I think that maybe you've gotten one little thing from Amazon that's something like this little tape measure here, right? But then it comes into a box that's the size of your kitchen sink, you know what I mean? Which is just ridiculous. So doing things like advocate for using less packaging, I think is a good idea as well. And then lastly, dematerialization, so decreasing the size and weight of products with new technologies, but products, of course, are still just as durable. Things like aluminum cans, right? Aluminum cans, tend to be better than plastic or glass. They can be compressed, right? So then you're getting rid of more for less, if that makes sense. The sizes of phones have decreased. The lifespan of some technologies have increased, right? Which is that's a whole other subsector of life to contend with, I guess. But what's also kind of interesting is something called industrial ecology. So waste from one industry can actually be used as raw materials from another. So this is a graphic from a previous edition of the textbook. And it's just kind of interesting, right? How I encourage you to pause the video and kind of take a deeper look at this graphic, since it's not in, that I've seen anyway, it's not in your current edition of the book. But basically things like steam can help a bioplant, which can support yeast as feed supplements for pigs, or ash from electric power stations can be used in roads. Or waste heat can help with a municipality, which the waste heat is in return, right? So really, really fascinating how you can basically take one person's trash and make it another person's treasure, right? Perhaps you've heard of that saying before. What's also really interesting in this whole idea is the product life cycle analysis. So this would be assessing the environmental impact at every stage of a product's life, from production to disposal. You, of course, can do this as well. Think about things in your day-to-day life that you perhaps use, and think about where the materials came from and how long, how much do those materials last. Try to not buy products that have disposal issues, right? So certain types of plastics or whatever. Think about this cradle-to-cradle analysis, which is kind of this interesting link here of looking at the life cycle analysis to describe a material or product that is recycled into a new product at the end of its life. So ultimately more zero waste sort of ideas, or things like take back laws, which of course would provide incentive for something called demanufacturing. So kind of interesting ways, I think, that we can kind of reduce our own individual usage. Next, we have reusing. So things like, in your home, you can buy products that are built to last, right? So you can reuse them over and over and over and over again. Actually, my partner and I were just talking about our drying rack for our dishes that can't be put into the dishwasher. It's like, okay, we definitely need to get a new one of these because it's pretty gross on the bottom of it. And I've had that since I lived in Tucson, so it's over 8 years old. So I think we've let it run its course. So I think it's time for us to get a clean one. Buying your food and drink in refillable containers. I have water bottles out the wazoo, so I really try to not use plastic water bottles, or using Tupperware if I make food at home or for food prep. things like that. Buying used and donating used items, things like Craigslist or thrifting. Thrifting is huge in the Bay Area, which I think is really awesome. I personally don't thrift that much. It's just not in my thing, but I also don't buy a whole lot of clothes either. But I do try and give my unused or unwanted clothes to either friends who are seamstresses or seamsters, or to thrift shops, or Salvation Army or homeless shelters. There's tons of ways that you can donate your used items. And then sharing things is huge as well, right? So libraries, you can borrow books. Car shares or ride shares, tool lending libraries, that's actually also a thing as well, which is really fascinating. So there's lots of ways that you can reuse and repurpose items. Next is rot, and I know that this sounds like a little bit weird and a little bit gross, but that's okay. But it's getting into this idea of composting, right? So just to keep with the alliteration of the 5 R's, rot is used here. So rot actually mimics nature. So this creates a usable product from waste, things like fertilizers. There's a huge percentage of our waste system that's compostable, as we have identified before. A lot of cities have curbside pickup for green waste. Here in San Francisco, it's a huge thing, right? So it's mandatory composting by law, which basically has resulted in all apartments and condos now having access to compost bins, woohoo! And all restaurants and grocery stores composting their food waste. Again, that's awesome. At the bar I work at, actually, we even get dinged by Recology if they notice that in our green bins is non-compostable items, which is kind of cool. But then even home composting, which is really, really neat if you have the space and ability to do so. My mother had composting, like these really big composting like bins that she was able to completely circulate. So using your food waste that is compostable, things like eggshells and vegetable scraps or coffee grounds, things like that. It's a really fascinating way, I think, to get rid of your food waste, which is kind of neat. So again, yeah, looking at home composting, kind of really neat here. So you have some of your brown materials like dead leaves, paper, straw, hay, and pine needles and wood chips, or green materials like grass clippings, food waste, livestock manure, tea leaves, bags, and green leaves, etc. Things to avoid would be things that don't break down, like meat scraps, bones, cooking oil, pet waste. So generally not a good idea. And then as you add air into that system or kind of circulate it a bit, that allows things to aerate and promote decomposition. And then you can use that composted materials to help with your gardening. So as I mentioned a bit earlier in the slide previous, it's like, oh, okay, well, my mom had these things and she has a huge garden. So she was able to use that composted material in her garden for it to be nice and fertile and create a lot of delicious foods for her. So that's a few of a start of the ways that you can shrink your own waste. I'm going to go ahead and actually split this into 2 different videos so that I can keep our attention for a little bit longer. So when we get back, we'll talk about different types of recycling and kind of diving into the ideas of recycling a bit and kind of circling all that back together and finishing off this particular unit. Thank you again so much for watching.